Hey guys, today I'm here to talk about taking an original SCX10 and converting it to an SCX10-2 style running gear. Most of you are well aware that the SCX10-2 is the newest release from Axial, and underneath of that truck is a much more scale style drivetrain. The SCX10 original had a much larger, bulkier axle that had some downfalls as far as durability and performance. But there is an abundance of original SCX10s on the market, and they can be found very cheap depending on the secondhand sites that you're looking at. I've seen them for under $100 without electronics or with poor quality electronics in them. What I've got in front of me here is a deadbolt, bone stock basically, other than a handful of parts that look like it was swapped on before I purchased it. This car ended up here just before the SCX10-2 was released. So sat on the shelf, and then the SCX10-2 came out, and basically I didn't find myself using the original SCX10-1 stuff all that much anymore. However, what I'm going to do today is take and use a bunch of new parts and convert this car from the SCX10-1 that it is now over to a car running SCX10-2 axles underneath of it. And I'm going to show you how easily that can be done using some of the new F9 parts from Vanquish. The new F9 SCX10-2 axles are made to accept a servo on axle. And what that's going to allow us to do is convert this car without having to mess with the servo mount, panhard setup, or front-mounted battery locations that were set by the Axial parts. To use all of those Axial parts, we'd have to buy a bunch of different parts trees or find aftermarket equivalents, and it could be a little bit of a headache, especially if you're trying to use other aftermarket parts that might have been designed for the SCX10-1 versus the SCX10-2, and the compatibility and clearances that they were all designed around. The new F9 axle with the servo on axle mount is going to go right up there, and we're basically going to be able to just drop the axles in there and go. I'm going to build the axles for this car completely from scratch without using any stock parts. Not necessarily the way you have to go. If you find an inexpensive set of axles you want to rob all the parts out of, that's an option as well. But for today, I'm going to build the axles from scratch, and that's what we're going to throw under. I am going to use a 12.3-inch wheelbase link kit for this car though, and that is a little bit different than the deadbolt wheelbase that you see in front of me. This car was built for a 12.0-inch wheelbase, and so we're going to see a little bit of a difference in the rear axle position, and depending on how that looks with those rear wheel wells, we may have to do some trimming. But if you've got almost any other Axial SCX10, you're not going to have that issue because almost all the rest of them were built for the 12.3-inch wheelbase, with the exception of the very old Dingo kit, which was built at like 11 point something. I would still push a lot of you to try and look for an old deadbolt just because it came with some nice upgrades with the drive shafts and transmission being the 32-pitch dual slipper design. So you end up with a really nice setup that's basically matches what Axial uses now in the SCX10-2 kits. So let's tear the axles out from underneath of this and begin the installation and assembly of the new axles we're going to put underneath of it.
I'll have a full parts list of all the parts available in the description below. We're going to start this install by attaching the Vanquish ring gear to the Vanquish SCX10-2 locker. The ring gear does include 3 grade 12.9 M2 screws to attach the ring gear to the locker. Once the locker is attached, we're going to install our fast eddy bearings onto the locker and ring gear assembly. Then we're going to install the one-piece bearing retainers on each side of the ring gear from the F9 axle kit. Once you have those two pushed on there, we're going to install the bearing onto our pinion gear. With the bearing on the pinion gear, press the pinion gear into the third member. Make sure that the pinion gear is fully seated down into that bearing pocket. We have one 5x11x4 bearing to install on the outside of that pinion gear. Before installation, I like to apply the grease to the ring gear. I just use a razor knife to apply a nice coating all the way around the ring gear. Now it's ready to drop the one-piece bearing retainer and ring gear locker assembly into the third member. It'll only go in one way, so that should be pretty easy to denote. Then we're going to attach the 4 screws that hold the ring gear assembly into the third member. Once that's all attached, we'll then push it into the rear axle assembly and tighten the 4 screws around the third member that attach the third member to the axle housing. The link mounts are built into the third member, so it's easy to see which is the top and which is the bottom. The rear axle also has a decorative plug that is a scale representative of the vent plug on a full-size axle. Now we're going to add our rear axle shafts, which will slide in, followed by another 5x11x4 bearing that goes on the outside. The rear axle bearing caps go in and install with one screw on the front and one screw on the back. For the front axle, build a third member just like we did on the rear axle. Put the third member into the axle housing, but do not attach the 4 screws that are included with the housing. Since we're going to be using the optional servo on axle bracket, it includes 4 slightly longer screws to deal with the increased thickness added by this mount. Place the mount over the third member as shown here, and then use the 4 screws that are included with the servo on axle mount to attach it all together. There's one long screw that will go through the upper link mounts that is also included with the servo on axle mount. The chromoly threaded inserts then slide into the front C-hubs. These are the threads that are provided to attach the knuckle onto the axle. We're now ready to install the front axle shafts. With the 5x11x4 bearing installed on the inner portion of the shaft, you can slide the universal into the axle. Just make sure that it's pressed in far and well seated. Now it's time to assemble the knuckle. Install the high steer arm onto the main body of the knuckle and attach it with the screws provided. Once the screws attach the high steer arm onto the main body of the knuckle, we can install the bearings. We're going to install a 5x11x4 bearing on the outside of the knuckle and a 10x15x4 bearing on the inside of the knuckle. Once that's done, we can then install the knuckle over the axle shaft that we previously installed and slide the whole assembly onto the axle housing. We're then going to use this brass bushing and M3 screw to attach the knuckle to the axle housing. We're going to use one on top and bottom of each knuckle. With the knuckles and shafts fully installed, make sure that everything is turning nice and adjust the tension of the screws on the top and bottom of the knuckle appropriately if you're seeing any binding. With both knuckles installed, we're ready to install this axle into the car. We are going to reuse the drive pins and 12mm hexes from our old axles rather than using new ones. Now we're going to install the upper links included with the servo on axle mount using the M3x35mm long screw that is included with the servo on axle mount as well. The lower links attach just like the factory links did. The front and rear axles are now complete and we're ready to install them into the deadbolt. We're going to remove the axles from the vehicle first. We're going to remove the lower link shock mount bolts as well as the set pin holding the wildboard drive shaft onto those factory SCX10 axles. We need to remove the upper link mount screws at the chassis side as well as the lower link mount screws in the skid plate. For the front axle, we also need to disconnect the servo and the servo arm from the servo linkage. We can now reinstall the old drive shaft onto the new SCX10-2 axles by reusing the set pin that we removed from the original drive shaft. Once this is done, we can begin the installation of the SCX10-2 axles into the chassis. We do this just like we just removed the old ones, replacing the upper link mount screws on the chassis side as well as the screws on the skid plate to attach the lower links. We now need to reattach the shocks with the included hardware from the F9 axles. One thing to note on the rear axle is that the drive shaft may be a little bit short. Because of the smaller size of the SCX10-2 pumpkin and the fact that this was a 12-inch wheelbase deadbolt rather than a 12.3, we may need to increase the length of that rear drive shaft. The front axle will install just like the rear with the exception that we need to add the servo. I am using the Vanquish servo clamps just to make sure that I can hold all the power that this tactic servo has. I did mention that we are going to reuse the 12mm hexes and drive pins from the original axles. So we're going to remove those and then reinstall them onto our new axles now. With all of that installed, we're ready to reinstall the wheels and tires. Or in this case, I actually decided to swap in some new Vanquish KMC wheels and some Falcon Wild Peaks. But that wraps up the actual conversion of this truck. And those axles look so much better underneath of there than the original SCX10 axles. And they'll steer better and have more clearance than we had before. One other thing that I did want to tackle is that the body on the deadbolt sits way too high. So I'm lowering it from this way too tall height to almost all the way down. To do this, it's a simple bit of trimming along the side of the body. The front and rear of the body can kind of sit behind the bumper and behind the rear body support. All it takes is just a small amount of trimming and you can get this body to look so much better and give the whole truck a much more aggressive stance. Here you can see just how that chassis mounted servo on the F9s sits into the chassis. I did do a little bit of trimming on a cross brace up there just for some wire clearance, but that is the same as it would have been in the factory SCX10 axle. So either way, it would have benefited from it.
So the conversion from the SCX10 to the SCX10-2 was pretty easy. Now, this was not a difficult project. However, of course, upgrading to a set of Currie axles is not the most affordable thing ever. But if you want a really nice set of axles and you either have an old SCX10 laying around or you want to pick up a cheap donor rig, this may be a great way to go if you've got a build in mind. After taking the old axles out and swapping the new SCX10-2 axles in, I went ahead and actually threw a set of wheels and tires on this as well. I mounted up a set of the Vanquish KMC machetes, and I had some Falcon Wild Peaks laying around, so I threw those on as well, just to finish up this build and get the old plastic bead locks off there, since we have some nice axles underneath of it now. So guys, that's all I wanted to accomplish with this video. I just wanted to take an old SCX10 and convert it to the new stuff. Something I hadn't done before in this way and thought I might as well tackle it once, since we had some new parts that were designed specifically to allow us to do something like this. So if you've got a project that could benefit from the servo on axle style setup rather than trying to deal with the pan-hardened CMS, this may be the route for you. Or if you just want to get the absolute most out of the truck and you want to go to a servo on axle and 4-link front suspension, it's also an option. It's up to you. It's just another option that you've got for your SCX10 or SCX10-2 build. Thanks for watching, guys. This was a fun one. I'll see you on the next one.